Hi and welcome to my video, how to play chess for absolute beginners. We're going to look at how the pieces move, how to set the board up, castle, captures, checks and checkmates, and at the end of the video I'll give you some recommendations on where you can learn more. I'm not a master, but I'm good enough to teach you how to play, so let's get straight into it, looking at how each piece moves and how to capture and stuff like that. This video is designed for anyone who's never played before, and there's a couple of basics I just want to go through before we start. The first one is that when you set the board up, make sure that a white square is always in the bottom right hand corner of the board. That's if it's black, you've got the board the wrong way around, you should swivel it around. Always have the white square in that corner. There are white and black pieces in the game, and white goes first, and each player makes one move per turn, and you take turns. Told you it'd be basic. Right, let's check out the king. The king is the most important piece for each player. If your king gets trapped, that's checkmate and you lose the game. We'll go more into that later on. Every piece that I'm going to show you today can capture pieces, providing that the piece is within the range of the piece that you're moving. Now for the king moves in one direction, in one square, in any direction, sorry. So any of these squares the king can move to. There are restrictions if that square is covered by another piece, but we'll get more into that later in terms of captures and checks and so on. But for now, you just need to know that the king moves one square in any direction. Next, we're going to look at the rooks. The rooks are also known as castles, but a decent chess player will always use the term rook. And the rooks move horizontally and vertically in straight lines, like so. So the rook could stop on any of the squares that I'm currently going over. A rook can't jump over its own pieces. So let's just say there was another piece here. The rook could still go along these lines, but it could not jump over its own piece. So your own piece can block a rook, but it only moves in straight lines. Next we have the bishops. Bishops are one of each colour and they move diagonally. And they can go as far as you want. So a bishop here can go all the way back down here. But they can only go in straight lines, so you can't, for example, do anything like that. You must move in straight lines and stop on a square within that line, providing it's not blocked by one of your own pieces. For example, the bishop could go there, down there and this way, but couldn't scale the queen. So that's the bishops. Now we're going to look at the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board, and that's because it has the movement of both bishops and rooks. The queen can go diagonally like a bishop in straight lines, and it can go horizontally and vertically like a rook. So the queen is really powerful and has a lot of influence on the board. Next we're going to look at the knights. The knights are also known as horses, but a good player will never call a knight a horse. New players often get confused by knights because they move in a very specific way and they have two specific differences to any other piece. A knight moves two squares in one direction and one across. It can't move in any other direction. It goes in this sort of funny L shape. If I just put the pawns in the shape that the knight travels in, that's how a knight travels, along that line. Now obviously you can say it also goes that way, but let's just keep it simple. Two squares forward or to the side and one moving to one side. So what I'm going to do, you might be thinking, what? So I'm going to put a pawn in each of the squares that this knight on this square can travel to. This might make it more clear that the knight goes two squares in a north, south, east or west direction, and then can choose to go one square left or right. So any of these pawns can be captured by the knight at its next move. Yeah. So the only other thing to be aware of, that if I was to place pawns right across the knight's path in this formation here, the knight, the only other thing about the knight, apart from the shape of its movement, is the fact that it's the only piece that can jump over other pieces, whether they're white or black. If that's a black pawn, if it was like that, the knight can still jump over it. Okay, so you just need to bear that in mind. The knight could travel to any of the squares, even though there's pieces in its path. That's the only piece that can do that. No other piece can jump over a piece, but the knight can. So this is the thing to be aware of, that it'll take a bit of practice. Don't get me wrong, when you first come across the knight, that'll confuse you. But the knight moves in the little L shape. And what I would suggest you do, if we just clear these pawns away, is just practice moving the knight around the board. After a while, you'll start just moving the knight around the board. You can even do this in your head if you're able to visualize. Just get used to where the knight goes. Okay, just move the knight around. It's not hard, but it is confusing to begin with. I appreciate that. And of course you get 2 knights each. Now we're going to look at the pawns. There's 3 things you need to be aware of with pawns: how to move with it, how to capture with it, and how to promote with it. With all of the other pieces, for example, I'll come on to it in the capturing part, but the reason that we're covering the pawns is because it's slightly unique, and you need to be thinking about pawns differently than any other piece. All of the other pieces capture by just taking a square in the path of where they're travelling to, and they just occupy that square instead of the opponent's piece. That's basically it. In terms of the pawns, we need to be aware of movement, how to capture, and promoting a pawn. So pawns start on the second row. The black's pawns start on the black pawn's second row. And the pawns move 1 square at a time forwards. It can't go to the side, certainly can't go backwards. On the first move, the pawn can go 1 or 2 squares. So for example, it's this pawn's first move, and you'll always know it's a pawn's first move because they're on the second row. For black or for white, let's put a white pawn in there, that pawn has to have moved from that square to there. It's impossible it starts there. If it does, you've messed up. So we know that a pawn on this rank, on its first move, so it can move to there, or it can just move 1 square to there. So the first move, it moves 2 or 1 squares, and then from that point, 1 square at a time. If you're fortunate enough to get your pawn to the end of the board, you have to promote the pawn to either a queen, bishop, knight, or rook. You cannot promote the pawn to another pawn, or stay as a pawn, and you can't promote it to another king. You must promote to another piece. 9 times out of 10, you want to promote to the best piece you can, which is a queen, and all you do is move your pawn and replace it with a queen. If you've queens still on the board, and you, for example, promoted a pawn here, you can use a rook turned upside down, or if you have to, leave it as a pawn. Some chess sets come with an additional queen, but many don't. But it's quite rare to have more than 2 queens, but you can always use a rook. Just be careful if you've got a nice chessboard like me, when you're moving the pieces, you know, here there could be a scratch issue, so just be careful with the pieces, because usually they come with felt, and that keeps it nice. Okay, so you can invert a rook, or you could just leave it as a pawn, but make sure that you remember, and your opponent, and whatever you do, don't mark it with chalk or something like that, because you might damage your chess set. But basically, the thing to bear in mind, the movement of a pawn is 2 squares on its first move, or 1, then 1, and when it gets to the end of the board, it becomes another piece, usually a queen. When a pawn is capturing something, because any piece can capture another piece, this is quite complicated. Let's say, for example, in this position, the white player moves 2 squares on its first move, and the black opponent repeats the move symmetrically and goes in front of the pawn. You might think that the white player can just capture the pawn. They can't. A pawn captures in one way only, diagonally forwards. So for example, here, the white pawn cannot capture this black pawn, but it could capture either of these two pawns. It cannot capture directly to the side, nor can it move backwards. So in this example, where the white, this would never happen by the way, but crazy example, there's only two ways the white pawn can capture, and it's there. The rest, it just isn't allowed to take, okay? Because a white pawn, any pawn, black or white, can't move backwards. So it captures either that or that, not directly straight ahead. So in this example here, the white pawn moves forward, the black pawn moves there. Because one square to the side ahead of the pawn, white could take that piece. If, let's say for example, the white person had a rook down here, decided to make another move, and black decided not to take, because the black could also take because that pawn is ahead diagonally to the pawn, decided to move forward, both pawns could no longer capture because white cannot move directly across. So the thing to think about is, in a V shape, the pawn captures ahead, so this pawn would be racing away and there's nothing that pawn could do about it. So as an example of an exchange, let's get another pawn, just one last thing, and this may seem confusing, but you'll soon get the hang of it. Let's say white moved two squares forward to like that, and black replied. Now instead of taking that pawn, white played one move, as it's allowed to do, to there, and black decided to capture with the pawn. White could then recapture with this pawn because capturing squares are there and there, like that. Or, and you wouldn't want to do that, which we'll go through in, you could decline the capture and move forward, at which point the game would continue, okay? So that's pawns. Now let's look at setting up the board. The board is always set up the same way, with the queen starting on her own coloured square. And this is why it's important to have the white square in the bottom right hand corner, because it means you end up setting up correctly elsewhere. So the queens go on their own coloured square, because we respect the ladies, and the king sits directly next to the queen on the opposing coloured square. Next to the queen and the king directly go the bishops. So if you just remember that, bishops next to the king and queen, it's always like, I always think, religious advisors next to king, queen. And an easy way to remember how to set the board up is that each colour has rooks. The rooks go in the corner, so you can actually do that first if you're not sure. Put the rooks in the corner. That means there's only one place for the knights to go, which is in between. So all of the pieces go in the corners of the board. Now you'll notice I have my knights facing that way. There's no hard and fast rule there, the knights can be just left funny, but I like to keep them tidy. And then with the pawns, you get 8 pawns each, and they go in front of all the pieces. So you should have rooks in the corner, then the knights, then the bishops, the queen on her own coloured square, the king on the final square at the back, and pawns across the front with a white square in the bottom corner. And that's how you set up a board.